In 1864, in the hills of what had just become West Virginia, a crew of workers sealed off the lowest level of a building so large it would stay the second biggest hand-cut stone structure on the planet for the next 100 years. The men who set those final stones were never named in any surviving record. The gold that was supposed to pay for the work had already disappeared, seized in the middle of a war that Western never asked to be part of. And the deepest section of the foundation, the level that sits below the basement, was closed off and quietly left out of every floor plan drawn afterward. They called it an asylum. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. For more than a century, that was the entire story. A hospital for the mentally ill, built by patient labor, opened in the middle of the Civil War. But the numbers never added up. The stone never matched the timeline. And the one question the history books refuse to sit with is almost embarrassingly simple. What was already down there before they built on top of it? To understand why that question matters, you have to look at what this building actually is, not what the plaque says. What the stone says. The main structure stretches nearly a quarter of a mile from end to end. Every block was cut by hand from sandstone quarried on the property. There are no steel beams, no modern cranes, no hydraulic lifts. According to the official record, the labor came largely from the patients themselves, people committed for conditions the era barely understood, working with hand tools to raise walls 2 and 3 feet thick. Think about that for a second. We are told that some of the most precise load-bearing masonry in North America was assembled by an untrained, unpaid, and in many cases severely unwell workforce during a war after the money ran out. And it came out so structurally sound that the building still stands today with almost no settling in the original walls. That is not how construction works. Not then, not now. Masons who have studied the stonework describe joints so tight you cannot slide a blade between them, the kind of fit that normally takes decades of training and a fully funded operation with skilled crews. And yet the timeline insists this rose out of the mud of a frontier state that had existed for barely a year. So where did the technique come from? Where did the wealth come from? And why does the deepest part of the foundation appear in no drawing anyone can produce? This is where the official economic history starts to crack. Construction was authorized in the 1850s when the region was still part of Virginia. The state allocated funds, and here is the detail that gets skipped. A significant portion of that funding was held in gold. When Virginia split and the war broke out, that gold became one of the most fought-over assets in the region. Union troops moved on Western specifically to secure it. The official account says the money was carried off to fund the new state government. But follow the logic. The gold that was supposed to build the asylum was seized. The war halted almost everything. And yet the building kept rising. Massive, precise, and expensive. Someone kept paying, someone kept building. With what and for whom, the record goes quiet. The gold seizure itself has become almost legend in the town. A detachment of Union soldiers, a bank vault, and tens of thousands of dollars in coin hauled out under guard and sent north. In the retelling, it is a clean military operation, money moved to keep it out of Confederate hands. But ask a simple follow-up and the story phrase. How much was actually there? Where exactly it went? Whether all of it ever reached the treasury it was supposedly protecting, the records that survive give you a number and a direction and very little else. For a sum that was meant to raise one of the largest structures in the hemisphere, the paper trail is remarkably short. Revisionist researchers who study this period argue that the official story has the timeline backwards, that the seizure of the gold was not the theft of construction money, it was the cover for something already sitting in the ground. Because here is what almost nobody talks about. The lower foundation of the Trans-Allegheny structure uses a different stone, cut in a different style than the walls above it. Photographs from restoration work show it clearly. The upper building is that warm, hand-cut sandstone everyone recognizes. But down at the base, below the level tourists ever see, the blocks are larger, greyer, and dressed with a flatness that the upper masons never quite matched. It looks less like the bottom of a hospital and more like the top of something older that someone decided to build on. There is a name for what these researchers think happened here, and it sounds absurd the first time you hear it: the mud flood. The idea is that across the 19th century, an enormous number of buildings ended up with their true ground floors sitting below the current street level. Windows half buried, doorways that now open into dirt. Whole first stories quietly turned into basements after the fact. You can walk cities on 3 continents and find it once you know the shape of it. Arched windows peeking out at ankle height, staircases that descend into sealed walls. The official reason is always the same. The land was raised, the streets were built up, the ground simply rose over time. But nobody can quite agree on where all that dirt came from, or why it happened to so many places inside roughly the same window of years. And at Trans-Allegheny, the lowest sealed level fits that pattern almost too neatly. A floor that was once meant to be entered, now buried, now closed, now politely relabeled as foundation. And that is the theory that will get you laughed out of a university history department, that the asylum was not built from nothing in 1858, that it was raised on top of a foundation that was already there, a structure from an earlier period the standard timeline has no room for. Whatever sat at the very bottom, in that sealed sub-level, was closed off in 1864 and written out of the plans. Now, the mainstream explanation for all of this is straightforward, and it deserves a fair hearing. Skilled European masons did immigrate to America in this era. Prison and asylum labor was real, and it was genuinely used on large public works. Buildings were often raised on older footings from previous projects for simple reasons of cost. Tight masonry joints are the mark of good craftsmen, not lost technology. And basements get sealed for drainage, for safety, for 100 boring reasons that have nothing to do with mystery. All of that is true. Any honest look at this has to hold it in view. But the revisionist camp pushes back with a question the boring explanation struggles to answer cleanly. If everything was so ordinary, why is the documentation so thin in exactly the places that would prove it? The names of the master masons who supposedly trained a patient workforce are largely missing. The complete original engineering drawings, the ones that would show the sub-foundation, are not on public display. And the financial trail of how a bankrupt, war-torn new state paid for one of the largest stone buildings on Earth is patched together with guesses. When the paperwork is cleanest, it tends to describe the parts of the story that flatter the official version. When it goes missing, it tends to go missing right where the strange things would be. Let me show you what I mean, because this is where it stops being about one building. The people who research this call it revisionist economic history for a reason. Their claim is not really about ghosts or aliens. It is about money and power. It is the argument that the wealth needed to build the grand stone architecture of the 19th century, the courthouses, the capitals, the vast institutions like this one, does not match the economic reality of the places that supposedly paid for it. A frontier county with dirt roads and a few thousand people does not, on paper, generate the capital to produce a quarter-mile of flawless hand-cut masonry. So either the official history is wildly underselling how rich and advanced these regions secretly were, or the buildings were not funded and built the way we are told at all. Both options break the standard story. And the sealed foundation under Trans-Allegheny sits right at the center of that contradiction. And this building is not alone. All across the country, in the same handful of decades, similar giants went up. Enormous asylums, capitals and exposition halls raised fast, finished ornate, and standing in places that had no business affording them. Many followed the same blueprint, the Kirkbride plan, long staggered wings reaching out from a central spire. Then, almost on schedule, a wave of them was emptied, condemned, demolished, or quietly repurposed. Grand structures built at impossible speed, then erased from living memory inside a generation or two. If you wanted to bury the true origin of a set of buildings, you could hardly design a cleaner method than this. Wrap them in a strange story, fill them with the forgotten, and pull most of them down before anyone thought to ask the right questions. Here is the timeline that keeps people up at night. The building is authorized, the gold is allocated, the war arrives, the gold is seized, construction should stop, it does not. The structure is completed anyway, on time enough to open its doors in 1864, and in that same year, the lowest level is sealed and removed from the record. Every one of those steps is documented in isolation. It is only when you line them up that the shape of the problem appears. The money to build it was gone before the hardest part of building it was finished. So one of two things happened. Either there was a second unrecorded source of wealth pouring into a small West Virginia town in the middle of a civil war, which raises its own enormous questions about where that came from. Or the hardest, most expensive part, the deep foundation, was not built in the 1860s at all, it was already finished. And the work of 1864 was not building, it was hiding. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Hiding something is a very different act than making it. If you have ever walked the lower corridors of the building, the ones open to tours today, you have felt it without being able to name it. The upper floors feel like a hospital. Grand, but human. Go down far enough and the proportions change. The ceilings get heavier, the stone gets colder and older. The tours stop at a certain point, and beyond that point are spaces the guides describe simply as unstable, or closed, or never mapped. Never mapped. In a building that has been photographed, surveyed, and turned into a tourist attraction for decades, there are still parts of the foundation that officially do not have a plan. What is down there? Honestly, nobody outside the restoration teams can say for certain, and the people who could clarify it have never released the full lower drawings. The mainstream answer is that it is nothing worth seeing. Collapsed passages, flooded voids, dead space, not worth the liability of opening. The revisionist answer is that in 1864, someone made a decision. That whatever the earlier foundation was, whatever it had been part of before an asylum was ever imagined for this hill, it was worth more sealed than seen. And so they closed it, left it off the maps, and let the story of patient labor and seized gold become the only story anyone remembered. Consider what sealing a level like that actually takes. You do not casually wall off the base of a quarter-mile building. It means bringing in stone, mortar and labor at the exact moment the project is supposedly broke and the war is at its worst. It means a deliberate decision, signed off by someone with authority, to spend scarce resources not on finishing the hospital above, but on closing whatever sat below. People do not spend money, they do not have to hide empty rooms. They spend it to hide something they have already decided you should never see. Here is the part that should bother you either way. We accept the impossible version without blinking. Untrained patients producing world-class masonry during a war, with no money, on top of a foundation nobody will show you, in a building so large it beat almost every other stone structure on earth. We are handed that, and we nod, because it came with a plaque and a founding date. But the moment someone asks a simple question about the stone that does not match, or the gold that vanished, or the level that was sealed, they get called a crank. Maybe the boring explanation is completely right. Maybe every strange detail has a dull answer buried in an archive somewhere. That is genuinely possible, and it might even be likely. But until someone produces the original lower drawings, names the masons, and traces the money that built the impossible parts after the funding was gone, the official history is asking you to trust a story that its own paperwork cannot fully back up. Something was sealed under the Trans-Allegheny Asylum in 1864. That part is not a theory. The only question is whether it was sealed to hide a hazard or to hide a history. And the fact that we still cannot get a straight answer, more than a century and a half later, might be the most revealing detail of all. A century and a half is a long time to keep a single room shut. It is a far longer time to keep a straight answer buried, and the people holding the drawings have had all of it to open the door and end the argument. The stone is still there. The sealed level is still there. And every year thousands of people walk the halls above it, standing on top of a question the record was carefully built to bury.